Ashwater, Texas. August, 1884. The heat came first. Always first. A heat so thick it sat on a man's chest like a hand pressing down. Out across the dry scrubland, the wind spun the dust into columns of gold, and amber beneath a sky burned white. Then the church bell. It had been silent for months. Nobody would say why. At the end of the street, an office door stayed shut through the long afternoon, sealed tight against the sun. Behind that door, a man who used to be somebody just sat, unmoving. In the bottom drawer, beneath a bottle of whiskey, there was a letter folded, so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The street changed all at once. A held breath moved down the boardwalk like weather rolling in from the west. Men stepped down off the planks. Women pulled their children close. Even the dogs stopped barking. For years. 9 graves. And a silence that had learned to make its own sound. Someone had just ridden into town.
Ashwater, Texas. August 1884. The heat came first. Always first. Before the dust. Before the fear. A heat so thick it sat on a man's chest like a hand pressing down, daring him to complain. Nobody complained in Ashwater. Not anymore. Because complaining required a kind of hope that this town had buried a long time back, and hope, once buried, does not dig itself back up on its own. The church had a bell. It hadn't rung in months. The mercantile had shelves, and half of them stood empty, because the freight wagons kept turning back at the county line. Turning back for no reason anybody would say out loud. The marshal's office had a door. It stayed shut most afternoons, sealed tight against the sun, and behind it sat a man, who used to be somebody. Now he just sat. Because doing nothing had become the only way to survive. And Ashwater had Emmett Drey. You felt him before you saw him. That was the thing nobody understood, until they lived it. A change in the air. A held breath moving down the street like weather rolling in from the west. Men stepped off the boardwalk. Women pulled their children close. Even the dogs stopped barking. Not because anyone told them to. Because 4 years of watching had taught every living thing in Ashwater the exact radius of a man like Drey, and exactly how far a body needed to stand to stay outside it. 4 years. 9 graves. And a silence so complete it had learned to make its own sound. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how it started. Not with gunfire. With paper. Winter of 1880. A consortium out of Galveston, calling itself the Sable Ridge Land Trust, had drawn a line on a map. Inside that line sat the Ashwater Basin. Scrubland, to anyone who didn't know better. Underneath it, though. Water. Deep aquifers worth more than gold, once the railroad finally punched through, and it would punch through, because the men financing Sable Ridge did not invest in maybes. They invested in certainties. Which meant they invested in men like Emmett Drey. The trust needed the land. The land had people on it. Small ranchers. Homesteaders. Families who'd broken that ground with their own hands, buried children in it, and had no intention of selling to a company they'd never met for a price some clerk decided was fair, from 400 miles away. So the trust sent a man to change their minds. Drey did not arrive with threats. He was smarter than that. He arrived with patience. With silence. He did nothing at all for 3 days, and doing nothing was its own kind of threat, because the whole town could feel him watching. Weighing. Deciding. On the 3rd day, a rancher named Jonas Pruitt made the mistake of deciding for him. Pruitt was big. Loud. The kind of man who built his whole reputation on being the biggest thing in every room he walked into, and who had never once tested that reputation against something actually bigger. He confronted Drey outside the mercantile. Called him a company dog. Told him to ride back to Galveston, and tell his masters that Ashwater men didn't sell to threats. Drey listened to all of it. Quiet. Patient. Almost bored. Then Pruitt's hand moved toward his gun. And that was the mistake. Because Drey's hand had already been waiting. Not reaching. Waiting. There's a difference. It's the difference between the men who go home for supper and the men who fill the graveyard behind the church. Witnesses said afterward they weren't sure they'd seen it happen at all. 1 second Pruitt was reaching. The next, he was on the ground, and Drey's revolver was already back in its holster, and the whole business had taken less time than a man needs to finish a sentence. Self-defense. Clean. Legal. The circuit judge, a man the trust paid considerably more than the county did, ruled on it inside the hour. After Jonas Pruitt, the trust's paperwork found considerably more willing signatures. That was the machine, if you understood what sat underneath it. Drey didn't ride out and murder people. That would have been messy. Traceable. What he did instead was simpler. Colder. Far more effective. He made himself visible. He made himself known. And then he waited for someone, anyone, to hand him the legal cover he needed. Because in 4 years, 9 men found a reason to reach for a gun in front of Emmett Drey. 9 men who, on any other day, in front of any other man, would have thought twice. Would have walked away. Would have lived long enough to see another Christmas. But something about Drey pulled the reach right out of them. Pride, maybe? Or fear curdling into something that looked like courage, but wasn't anything close to it. Whatever it was, Drey had learned to summon it the way a hunter calls game out of thick brush, and once it was out, once the hand moved, the outcome stopped being a question. 9 funerals. 9 files marked closed. And underneath every single one, land that changed hands inside the month. The 9th man had been different. His name was Caleb Voss, and he wore a Texas Ranger's badge, and he rode into Ashwater 2 years before this particular August, because word of the killings had finally reached Austin, and somebody, at long last, decided it was worth a look. Voss was careful. Methodical. He spent 4 days interviewing witnesses, reviewing the judge's rulings, building a case, with the kind of patience that should have kept a man alive. It didn't. On his 5th night in town, a card game at the Silver Anchor turned ugly. A drunk cowhand, his debts later found to be conveniently forgiven by a man connected to the trust, accused Voss of cheating. Words became shoving. Shoving became a reach for a gun that wasn't even Voss's fight, until Drey, sitting 3 tables over, calmly stood and announced to the room that a ranger drawing on an unarmed civilian was the kind of thing that needed settling. It wasn't true. Voss hadn't drawn on anyone. But by the time anyone could say so, Voss lay dead in the sawdust, with his own revolver 3 feet from his open hand, and the story that got written down was the only story that mattered. Because the man writing it worked for the trust. The case Voss had built vanished with him. His report was never filed. His notes were never found. Ashwater went back to being quiet. Marshal Ezra Combs had watched all 9 killings, or arrived close enough behind them to see the bodies, while they were still warm, and he had written up every single one exactly the way the circuit judge told him to. He was 51. Looked closer to 65 most mornings. He'd been elected marshal 6 years back on a promise to keep the peace in a town that, at the time, hadn't needed much keeping. Cattle disputes. The occasional drunk. Nothing that had prepared him for what came through Ashwater's doors 4 years later. He kept his office doors shut most afternoons now. Not laziness. A surrender so total it had become routine. A groove worn into the man the way a wagon wheel wears a rut into a road, deeper each time it passes, until the road forgets it was ever anything else. He kept a bottle in the bottom drawer. Some days that bottle was the only honest thing left in the whole building. There was a letter in that drawer too. Underneath the bottle. Folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. A letter from Caleb Voss, written the night before he died, addressed to his superior in Austin, laying out exactly how the trust operated, exactly which local officials had been paid, and exactly who had ordered him watched, from the hour he first arrived. Voss had given it to Combs for safekeeping. Just in case. Combs never sent it. Because sending it meant admitting he'd known. Sending it meant standing up in a town that had learned brutally, completely, what happened to men who stood up. Sending it meant becoming the 10th grave, and Ezra Combs already had a wife buried behind that church, and he was not in any particular hurry to join her. Not for a dead ranger's unfinished business. Not yet. So the letter stayed. Under the bottle. 2 years. Every single day, Ezra Combs told himself he'd send it tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Because tomorrow required a kind of courage Combs had stopped believing he owned. Duke Farrow ran the Silver Anchor Saloon. He'd built his entire daily existence around one fact, and one fact only. Emmett Drey liked his bourbon-poured 2 fingers, Old Talbrook, no ice, ready the second the batwing doors so much as trembled. Duke had come out, from Ohio 9 years back, with the vague idea of finding something better than what he'd left behind. He found Ashwater instead. Bought the saloon, with the last of his savings. For 5 years it was a good, quiet business. Cattlemen. Card games. The occasional traveling salesman, with a suitcase full of tonics. Then Drey arrived. And quiet took on a heavier meaning. Duke didn't hate him. Hatred required energy Duke didn't have room for anymore, not after watching what happened to men who let their feelings show on their faces around Drey. What Duke felt instead was closer to reading weather. Every morning he checked which way the wind was blowing and adjusted accordingly. Drey came in around 2 most afternoons. Duke made sure the bourbon was poured by 1:45. That was survival in Ashwater. You learned the schedule of the thing that could kill you. You built your whole life, so it never got disturbed. On the last Monday of August, 1884, Emmett Drey walked into the Silver Anchor at 2 in the afternoon, same as always, and found a stranger already standing at the far end of the bar. This alone wasn't unusual. Ashwater sat on the road between San Angelo and the Pecos crossing. Travelers came through regular enough. What was unusual, what stopped Drey for exactly half a second in the doorway, a pause so small only a handful of men would ever swear to having seen it, was the total absence of the one thing Drey expected from every room he entered. Fear. For years had taught him to read a room the way another man reads a newspaper. Card players who stopped mid-hand and kept their fingers very still on the felt. Drinkers who found something urgent to study on the wall in front of them. Even the brave ones gave themselves away, held breath, stiff shoulders, the careful avoidance of any gesture that could be read as threat. This stranger gave away none of it. He stood with his back to the wall. Which was the first thing Drey noticed, because it was exactly what Drey himself always did. He held a glass of rye in his left hand. Which meant his right hand hung free. Which was the second thing Drey noticed. His coat was canvas, the color of dried creek mud, heavy with the kind of trail dust that told a story of long, hard miles. His hat brim had cracked along the front edge, the way years of the same sun beating the same fold will crack a thing eventually. His boots were plain. Functional. Nothing about him announced a single thing. Except the gun. That was the third thing. The one that mattered. A plain holster, tied low against the thigh, with a strip of rawhide gone dark and soft with age. The leather worn, so smooth on the inside it caught the dim light, and threw it back in a faint, dull gleam. The weapon inside wasn't decorated. Wasn't polished. A Colt single action, the bluing worn away in patches, the wooden grip scuffed pale, from 10,000 small contacts, with that same holster. Not a showpiece. A tool. Used so many times it had become part of the hand that carried it. Drey recognized what he was looking at. He wished, later, and there would be a later, though not the kind he expected, that he hadn't let the knowing show on his face, not even for that half-second in the doorway. Because Duke saw it. And 2 miners at the corner table saw it. And in a room that had spent 4 years learning to read Drey's every twitch the way sailors read a changing sky, that half-second registered like a gunshot. Drey crossed to the center of the bar. Took his place. did not look at the stranger again directly. He looked instead into the long mirror behind the bar, which gave him the stranger's profile, without the vulnerability of a stare, and found the stranger already looking into that same mirror. Their eyes met in the glass. One flat, silent moment. The stranger looked away first. Not fear. Drey knew fear the way a physician knows a pulse, and this wasn't that. This was something else. A man finishing an assessment. Filing the results away as unremarkable. Returning his attention to his drink, because at that moment, his drink was simply more interesting. Heat crawled up the back of Drey's neck. For years. 9 men. He had been feared in this town the way weather gets feared. Feared the way a man fears the rattle of a snake he can hear, but hasn't yet spotted. He had never, not once, in all that time, been dismissed. "Duke," he said. "Pitch to carry." Duke set the bourbon down, hand not quite steady. "Sir." "Who's this?" "Rode in about an hour ago, Mr. Drey." "Passing through, best I can tell." "Passing through." Drey turned on his stool. "Friend. You're awful quiet for a man in a public house." "Nothing." The stranger finished the last of his rye. Set the glass down, with the deliberate gentleness of a man who understood exactly how loud silence could be, and used it on purpose. "I'm talking to you," Drey said. The edge came in now. Fine and cold. A tone Duke had heard 8 times before, always right before a man stopped breathing. The stranger turned his head. Under the cracked brim, in the shadow, where his face lived, a pair of eyes found Drey's. Gray. The particular gray of iron left in the rain too long. Empty. Not blank. Not stupid. Emptied on purpose, scraped clean of every single thing Drey was used to seeing in the eyes of men he addressed. No fear. No calculation. No anticipation. Just attention. Patient. Total. The way a man watches a door he already knows is about to open. "I heard you," the stranger said. 4 words. Quiet as water sliding under ice. In the corner, 2 miners traded a look that carried an entire conversation neither of them would ever say out loud. Drey set down his bourbon. Stood. Crossed until 8 feet separated them. Close enough for conversation. Close enough for business. "You got a name?" "Not one I'm sharing today." Drey's right hand hung loose at his side, fingers slightly curved. Not hovering. Not threatening. Present. The way a snake is present, before it decides anything at all. "Folks in Ashwater introduce themselves, when they drink in my town. Courtesy. I'm Emmett Drey." A pause waited. "You know who I am?" "I do." No inflection. No fear. Stated the way a man states the time of day. Drey had killed men for less than that flat, factual tone. Every soul in the Silver Anchor knew it. And yet, something in the bottomless stillness of the stranger made the reflex hesitate. For the first time in 4 years, there was nothing to grab onto. No fear to sharpen into a blade. No pride to bait into a mistake. The man simply stood there. Finished with his drink. Willing to wait however long it took for whatever came next. "My town," Drey said softer now. "My saloon. My county. You're breathing my air, friend. Least a man can do is be sociable." The stranger looked at him a long, flat moment. Then looked past him. To Duke. "Another," he said. The room went entirely silent. Here is the thing about silence, the true and terrible thing nobody tells you, until you have lived inside one. It has weight. It presses. It has a temperature, and in the Silver Anchor, that afternoon the silence went cold enough, that Amos Teague, an old freighter who'd hauled goods across that territory for 30 years, and had the kind of eyes that had seen everything the frontier could throw at a man, quietly set down his cards. He didn't say anything. He just slid his chair back 6 inches. Because 30 years teaches a man exactly where the safe distance sits, and Amos Teague had learned it the hard way more than once, and he was not interested in learning it a third. Drey's jaw tightened. His pale green eyes, always calculating something, went hard. "You're either the bravest fool I ever met," Drey said, voice dropping into the register he used right before things turned permanent, "or the biggest damn one to ever ride into Ashwater." The stranger accepted the refilled glass from Duke's shaking hand, looked at the amber liquid, looked at Drey. "I'm just thirsty," he said. Third time he'd spoken. It landed the same way the first two had. A stone dropped into deep, still water. No splash. Just weight, going down and down. Except this time it did something else. This time it made Amos Teague understand something Drey himself was still catching up to. The stranger wasn't defying him. Wasn't challenging him. Wasn't performing courage for an audience the way brave men and foolish men both like to do right before they died, proving which one they were. He was simply getting a drink. And the fact that Emmett Drey, killer of 9 men, instrument of the Sable Ridge Trust, terror of an entire basin, happened to be standing 8 feet away, that fact registered on the stranger's face, with roughly the same weight as the heat. Or the flies. Or the poor quality of the whiskey. He had been measured. And found irrelevant. Across the street, in the shadowed doorway of the marshal's office, Ezra Combs watched the whole thing, through a window thick with dust, and something cold moved through his chest that had nothing to do with the heat. He had seen Drey's setups before. The casual entrance. The territorial display. The engineered insult, built brick by careful brick, until the other man had no path left except the one ending in the street. He'd written 9 reports on that exact pattern. He had no plans to write a 10th. But something about this one felt wrong in his gut. 30 hard years of lawing across 3 territories had taught Ezra Combs to trust his gut the way other men trusted scripture. He pushed himself up, knees protesting, crossed to the window. The stranger's horse stood at the hitching rail. A dark bay gelding. Unremarkable. Dusty from the road. But its head was up. Ears forward. Calm despite the heat, in a way that told Combs, instantly, this was an animal trained not to spook at gunfire. And the reins weren't tied. Just draped. Combs stood very still. Because a draped rein meant a man who expected to leave in a hurry. Or a man who didn't expect to leave at all. Either way. A man with no intention of wasting time on a knot. Combs picked up his shotgun. Didn't go outside. Some part of him wanted to, the part that still remembered being brave, buried now under 2 years of a folded letter and a bottle in a bottom drawer. But he stood at the window instead, and watched, and felt the specific crawling cold of a man who knows something bad is coming, and knows there is nothing he intends to do about it. Inside, Drey had made his decision. Not easily. Which itself was a new sensation, because Drey processed confrontation the way other men process breathing. Automatic. Clean. Unremarkable. This stranger had introduced a variable he never encountered before. And the variable had a name. The absence of leverage. No fear to weaponize. No pride to bait. No performance to interrupt with violence, because the stranger wasn't performing anything at all. That was the calculation that settled it. The room was watching. Duke. The miners. Amos Teague, half hidden now behind his own hat brim. 2 cowhands who'd come in early. The piano player, frozen on his bench, hands hovering over keys he'd stopped touching 3 minutes back. If Drey walked away from a dust-covered nobody, who wouldn't give his name, wouldn't flinch, wouldn't even do him the courtesy of fear, then the architecture holding this whole town together, for years of careful brick, would crack. And cracks spread. Drey had seen it happen in other towns. The slow leak of authority once a man questions it, and lives to talk about it. He walked back to the center of the room. Outside, he said. You and me. Main Street. Now. The stranger took another sip. Unhurried. I didn't come here for trouble. It came for you anyway. A pause. Your choice, the stranger finally said, and it was impossible to tell, even for the men standing closest, whether he meant it for Drey or the room, or no one at all. He set down his glass, reached into his coat, placed a coin on the bar, without looking at Duke. Stood. Turned toward the door. And that was the moment the door of the Silver Anchor did not open the way it was supposed to. Because before either man could take a single step toward the batwing doors, before Drey could turn his shoulder toward the sun outside, the floor of the saloon shook. Actually shook. A thing every man in that room would swear to for the rest of his life. Under the weight of footsteps that did not belong to anyone small. Every head turned. There, filling the doorway the way a storm front fills a horizon, stood Nora Voss. She was not large the way some women get called large out of politeness or exaggeration. She was, plainly, one of the tallest people most men in that saloon had ever stood in a room with, taller than Drey by a full head, shoulders built broad and hard from years working iron, forearms bare below rolled sleeves, and corded with muscle that had nothing decorative about it. Her hair was tied back, dark, streaked at the temple, with early gray she had earned the honest way. A leather apron, scorched in places, still hung from her frame, because she had walked here straight, from her forge, without stopping to think whether that mattered. She smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. She carried in one hand down at her side a forging hammer, with a handle worn smooth, from years of her own grip. Not raised. Not threatening. Simply carried. The way a person carries whatever happens to be in their hand, when something more important pulls them out the door. 2 years, this town had known Nora Voss, as the widow of the ranger, who died in the sawdust of a card game gone bad. 2 years, they had watched her run the forge at the edge of Ashwater alone, shoe every horse, mend every wagon axle, speak to almost nobody about the husband she had buried. They had never, not once, seen her walk into the Silver Anchor. She stopped just inside the doorway. Did not look at the stranger. She looked at Drey. Not today, she said. Her voice filled the room the way her body filled the doorway. Not shouted. Didn't need to be. Drey turned toward her slowly, and something crossed his face that no man in that saloon had ever seen there before. Not once in 4 years. Not even the day Jonas Pruitt's hand moved toward his gun. It wasn't fear exactly. Closer to confusion. The specific, disorienting confusion of a man whose entire language for controlling a room had just met something it had no words for. Nora. He said her name carefully. The way a man tests ice. This isn't your business. Made it my business the second I heard you were about to shoot a man in my street, over a glass of whiskey he already paid for. A ripple moved through the room. Duke's hand, still resting on the bar, went completely still. You don't want to do this, Drey said, and his voice had lost some of its register. Some of the cold cadence he used right, before things turned permanent. I don't want a lot of things, Mr. Drey. Nora took one step forward. The floorboards groaned under it. I didn't want to bury my husband and ground your trust is trying to steal out from under this whole basin. I didn't want to watch this town learn how to look at its own boots every time you walk down the street. Wanting's got nothing to do with what I'm willing to stand in the middle of. Drey's jaw worked. His right hand, the hand that had ended 9 lives, without a single wasted motion, twitched at his side. And stopped. Because here was the thing Emmett Drey had never once had to calculate in 4 years of careful, methodical violence. What happens to a man's authority, in front of a room full of witnesses, if he draws down on an unarmed woman standing in a doorway? What happens to the story that gets told afterward? What happens to the fear that keeps the town quiet, if the fear starts to look like cruelty instead of strength? There was no clean math for it. No version where he came out the other side the same man who'd walked in. For one long, suspended moment, nobody in the Silver Anchor breathed. Then Emmett Drey, for the first time in 4 years, in front of every soul in that room, took a step back. This isn't finished, he said. Quiet. To Nora. To the stranger. To the room, maybe. Or maybe just to himself. He turned, walked to the bar, picked up the bourbon he'd never touched. Drank it in one motion. Set the glass down hard enough to crack it. Then he walked out, through the batwing doors, into the white blast of afternoon sun, and the street outside swallowed him whole. The saloon exhaled all at once, the way a held breath finally lets go. For a moment nobody moved. Nobody spoke. As though the room itself needed time to understand what it had just witnessed. Duke found his voice first. "Ma'am. I never seen." "I know," Nora said. Not unkindly. Just final. She turned to look, for the first time, at the stranger still standing near the door, hat in one hand. He looked back at her. Gray eyes meeting something in hers, harder to read, grief worn down smooth by 2 years of hard labor, but grief all the same, sitting underneath the anger like bedrock underneath a river. "You didn't have to do that," he said. First words he'd offered anyone, but Drey since he'd ridden in. "No," Nora agreed. "I didn't." She held the hammer a moment longer than she needed to. Then let it hang loose at her side, the way a person lets go of something once the danger that made them grip it has passed. "You're not from around here." "No, ma'am." "You knew who he was before you walked in." Not a question. He didn't treat it like one either. Quiet a moment, weighing something behind those flat gray eyes, deciding how much truth a stranger in a doorway deserved. "I knew," he said finally. Nora studied him. The trail dust. The worn holster, rawhide gone soft from use. The particular stillness in his hands, a kind she recognized. Because she'd seen it once before, in a man she used to share a supper table with. Something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe? Or the beginning of it. "What's your business in Ashwater?" she said. He looked past her, out through the batwing doors, to the street, where Drey had gone, to the hard white light of a Texas afternoon, that had almost turned to blood 20 minutes earlier and, for now, hadn't. "Unfinished," he said. "Same as most things." He put his hat back on. Started toward the door. "My name's Cole," he said, not turning around, as though the words cost him something to hand over even now. "Judah Cole." And then he was gone, out into the sun, the doors swinging shut behind him, with a soft, worn creak, and the whole silver anchor stood in the ringing quiet that follows a thing almost happening. Outside, the street had gone strange, with the particular stillness of a town holding its breath twice in one afternoon. Cole stood on the boardwalk a moment, letting his eyes adjust, from the dim saloon light to the hammering white of open sky. Down the street he could see Drey's back disappearing, into the shadowed doorway of a building, with Sable Ridge Land Trust painted in careful gold letters above the frame. An office, clean and out of place among the weathered storefronts around it, the way a starched collar looks wrong on a work shirt. He didn't follow. Not yet. Because there was a rhythm to this kind of business. He'd learned it the hard way, in blood and in silence, in 2 years of riding alone, with nothing but a debt in his chest, that never seemed to get lighter no matter how many miles he put between himself and the reason for it. You didn't walk into a fight before you understood the shape of it. And the shape of Ashwater, Cole understood already, standing there with the saloon door creaking shut behind him, was bigger than one bad man, with a fast gun. It always was. The gun was never the whole problem. The gun was just the last visible piece of something larger, something with a name, and an office, and a signature on a piece of paper somewhere in Galveston. He looked the other direction. Toward the edge of town, where a thin column of dark smoke rose steady against the pale sky. A forge working. Someone's hammer striking iron in a rhythm that carried faint on the still air. Nora Voss's forge. Cole stood there a long moment, turning something over behind those flat gray eyes. The way she'd said his. No. Not his name. She hadn't known his name yet. But the way she'd looked at his hands. The way something had shifted in her face, subtle, almost nothing, right before she asked him his business. Like she'd recognized something. Or someone. He untied his horse, from the rail, reins draped loose the way a man leaves them, when he doesn't plan on being anywhere long, and led it by the bridle down the street, toward the smoke, toward the steady ringing sound of hammer on iron. Behind him, unseen, the curtain in the second-floor window of the Sable Ridge office moved an inch, and a pale, careful face watched him go. Cornelius Wexler had not built an empire out of land deeds and quiet threats by being a man who missed things. He stood at that window alone, while after the curtain fell back into place, hands folded behind his back, the posture of a man accustomed to watching other men do his work for him, from a safe distance. 58 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a fine dark suit that had never once seen the inside of a saloon fight, because Cornelius Wexler did not fight. He arranged. He financed. He waited. He had watched, from this same window, 9 men die in the street below, over 4 years, and he had felt, each time, a small cold satisfaction. Not pleasure exactly. The specific relief of a ledger balancing the way it was supposed to. He had not expected to watch Emmett Drey back down. Not from anyone. Not from a stranger, with a worn coat, and a face like a closed door, and certainly not from Nora Voss, standing in a saloon doorway, with a blacksmith's hammer, of all the unaccountable things. Wexler crossed to his desk. Saturday. Pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward himself, and a pen, and sat there a long moment simply staring at the blank page, turning something cold and careful over in the back of his mind. There was a name in a locked drawer of that desk. He'd kept it there a little, over 2 years now, ever since a Galveston business dinner, where a partner mentioned a former ranger who'd gone into the paid gun trade, a man whose reputation was already climbing fast in the towns south of Fort Worth. Wexler had written the name down, that same night, tucked it away, as insurance, and never once needed it. Because Emmett Drey had never given him reason to think he'd need a second option. He unlocked the drawer. The paper inside had already begun to yellow at the edges. A name. Beneath it, an address in Fort Worth. Beneath that, in Wexler's own careful hand, a single line, never fails to close a contract. He did not write the telegram yet. Not yet. Drey had backed down, yes, but backing down wasn't the same as failing, and Wexler was not a man who spent money before spending it became necessary. He would watch. He would wait, and see whether the stranger rode on the way most drifters did once the excitement passed, or whether he stayed, and asked questions, and became the kind of problem that needed a different kind of solution. He folded the paper, set it on the corner of his desk, within easy reach, and went back to the window to watch the smoke rising from the forge, and the tall shape of a man leading a dark horse toward it. The forge sat apart from the rest of Ashwater. Close enough to be useful, far enough that the noise and heat didn't crowd the town's daily business. A low building of timber and stone, open on one side to let the smoke escape, the anvil positioned just inside the shadow of the overhang, where a person could work through the worst of the afternoon sun, without losing the light entirely. Nora was already there when Cole arrived, having taken the back way from the saloon, apron back in place, hammer already at work on a length of glowing iron laid across the anvil. She didn't look up as he approached, though the set of her shoulders told him she'd heard the hooves on hard-packed dirt a good 30 yards back. Didn't expect company, she said, striking the iron once, twice, the sound sharp and clean in the still afternoon. Didn't expect to be giving any? She set the hammer down, turned to look at him fully for the first time since the saloon, and in the harder outside light, Cole could see what the dim bar hadn't shown him. Fine lines of grief worn into a face that had otherwise stayed strong, stayed hard, the particular exhaustion of a person who'd been carrying something heavy a long time, and had simply learned to walk without setting it down. You've got the look of a man who came here looking for something, she said. Or someone. Cole was quiet a moment. The gelding shifted behind him, tail flicking against the heat. 2 years back, he said finally, a Texas Ranger died in the Silver Anchor. Card game gone bad, way the report tells it. Something went very still in Nora's face. You knew him, she said. Not a question this time either. Rode with him 3 years before that. Trained with him before that. Cole's jaw tightened, The first crack of real feeling Nora had seen pass through that carefully closed expression. He wasn't the kind of man who cheated at cards. And he sure as hell wasn't the kind of man who drew on an unarmed cowhand for no reason. Nora set down the tongs she'd been holding. Her hand, Cole noticed, wasn't quite steady. "Caleb," she said. "Quiet." The name coming out of her like something long buried finally given air. "You're his wife. His widow." The correction came out flat, worn smooth by 2 years of saying it. 2 years I've been asking this town what really happened that night, and 2 years I've gotten the same answer everybody else gets. Card game. Bad luck. Case closed. She looked at him hard, something fierce kindling behind the grief now. "You're telling me you rode all this way, because you don't believe it either." "I'm telling you," Cole said, "I never stopped not believing it. Not for one single day." The forge crackled behind them. Iron cooling. Smoke thinning against the pale sky. "Then you and I," Nora said slowly, "might have more to talk about than either one of us figured on this morning." Cole looked at her a long moment. At the hammer resting against the anvil, the same hammer that had stopped a killer in a doorway not 20 minutes earlier. At the grief, and the iron-hard patience both sitting in the same tired face. "Might be," he said. Behind them, far down the street, the shadow of Emmett Drey passed once more across the window of an office, with gold letters. And in a locked drawer inside that office, a folded piece of paper, with a name on it waited, patient as everything else in Ashwater had learned to be. The sun was already sliding toward the western hills, throwing the whole town into a long, orange, uneasy light. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where he kept the promise he'd made to a dead man 2 years, and 1,000 miles ago, Judah Cole understood that whatever had almost happened in that saloon today was not finished. It was only getting started. The smoke from Nora's forge had gone thin and pale against the sky by the time either of them spoke again. Cole stood with one hand resting on his gelding's neck. Not looking at her. Looking instead at the anvil. At the cooling iron. At anything that wasn't her face, because her face right now was doing something to him he hadn't let himself feel in 2 years, and he wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "You were there," Nora said. Flat. Not a question. "No. But you said you rode with him. Trained with him." "I did." "So where were you?" Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "The night he died. Where were you, Mr. Cole?" And there it was. The question he'd carried 1,000 miles, folded up small and hard inside his chest. The one he asked himself every morning, before his eyes were even open. Every night before sleep finally took him under. "Where were you?" "Fort Concho," he said. 200 miles north. Chasing a horse thief who didn't matter. While Caleb rode into this town alone, because I let him." "You let him?" "I was supposed to ride with him." The words came out slow. Cut short. Like each one cost something to hand over. "Captain split us. Said the thief case was priority. Said Ashwater could wait for backup." A pause. "I said fine." "I said yes, sir." "I let him ride into a town full of Sable Ridge money by himself, because a man in an office 200 miles away decided a stolen horse mattered more." Nora didn't say anything. Because there wasn't anything to say to that. "Not yet." "I got the telegram 4 days later," Cole said. 4 days. He'd already been in the ground 3 of them. The forge popped. A log settling. Somewhere behind them, a horse whickered at nothing. "I resigned my commission the week after," Cole went on. "Rangers don't take kindly to men who quit. Don't much care. I wasn't a ranger anymore the day I read that telegram. I was just a man, with a debt, and no idea yet how to pay it." Nora studied him a long moment. 2 years of grief sat behind her eyes like water behind a dam, and Cole watched something in her fight itself. Whether to let some of it out. Or hold. The way she'd apparently been holding for 2 years straight. "You rode 200 miles a week," she said. Then kept riding. For 2 years. Wasn't looking for Ashwater special. Wasn't looking for anything special. Just kept following whatever thread I could find. Names. Rumors. A land trust, with too much money, and too many quiet men on its payroll. He looked at her now. Finally. Then a month back I heard a name. Sable Ridge. Same trust that paid the judge, who ruled Caleb's death and accident. And I thought. He stopped. You thought this was it, Nora finished for him. I thought this was it. Because here's the thing about grief, the true thing, the thing nobody tells you, until you're standing in it up to your neck. It doesn't care how far you ride. Doesn't care how many towns you leave behind. How many horse thieves you don't chase anymore. How many nights you spend under open sky telling yourself tomorrow will be different. It just waits. Patient the way Nora had learned to be patient, 2 years running a forge alone at the edge of a town that wouldn't say her husband's name out loud. Patient the way Ezra Combs had learned to be patient behind a shut office door, with a letter rotting under a bottle. Patient the way this whole town had learned patience, the specific corrosive kind, people waiting for a change they'd stopped believing would ever come. Cole understood patience too. 2 years of it. Except his patience wasn't waiting. His patience was hunting. And now the hunt had led him here, to a forge at the edge of a town called Ashwater, standing across from a woman, with iron-strong hands, and a grief that matched his own note for note, and something in Cole's chest, something he hadn't let move in 2 years, shifted. Which scared him more than Drey ever could. Because Drey he understood. Drey was math. Distance and timing, and the geometry of a fast draw against a slow one. A problem Cole knew how to solve. This. Whatever this was, standing in a forge yard, with a widow, who had just looked at him like he might be the answer to a question she'd stopped asking. This Cole did not know how to solve at all. You should eat something, Nora said, breaking the silence, before it could go anywhere either of them was ready for. You look like a man who forgot food exists. Ma'am. Nora. Nora. The name sat strange and careful in his mouth, like something he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to use yet. I appreciate it. But I've got business in this town, before I sit down to supper. Drey. Drey. She looked at him a long moment, weighing something. He'll come for you tonight, or tomorrow, she said. Man like that doesn't let a room see him back down, and just let it lie. He'll need it back. The fear, I mean. He'll need this whole town scared of him again by sundown tomorrow, or the fear starts leaking out everywhere at once, and once it starts leaking, it doesn't stop. I know. Do you? Her eyes were hard now, something protective underneath the hardness. Because you didn't see what he did to Jonas Pruitt. Didn't see what he did to the two, before Caleb either. I did. I've lived here 2 years watching what he does to men, who make him feel small in front of a crowd. And today, in that saloon, you made him feel smaller than anyone ever has. Cole was quiet. So did you, he said finally. Something passed over Nora's face. Not quite a smile. Something harder and more tired than a smile, but close enough to one that Cole felt it land somewhere in his chest anyway. Yeah, she said. So did I. Emmett Drey did not go back to his rented room above the Mercantile the way he usually did, after a long afternoon in the Silver Anchor. He walked instead the length of Main Street, boots striking hard against the packed dirt, past the marshal's office, where Ezra Combs watched him go by, from behind dust-streaked glass, past the Mercantile, where a woman pulled her child inside the second his shadow crossed the window, past every storefront, where people had spent 4 years learning the exact choreography required to avoid his eyes. He walked straight to the gold-lettered door of the Sable Ridge office, and let himself in without knocking. Wexler was at his desk, exactly where he always was, folded hands, dark suit, the particular stillness of a man who had already known this visit was coming, before it arrived. Emmett. Wexler didn't look up, from the papers in front of him. I trust the afternoon went well. You saw. I saw enough. Drey crossed the room. Stopped in front of the desk. His hands, Wexler noticed, the same hands that had ended 9 men, without so much as a raised pulse, were not entirely steady. That woman, Drey said. The blacksmith. Nora Voss. Wexler said the name the way a man reads a line off a ledger. Flat. Unremarkable. Ranger's widow. Runs the forge at the edge of town. You knew she'd do that. I knew nothing of the sort. Now Wexler looked up. Pale eyes, careful, the eyes of a man who had built a fortune out of never once showing his hand before it mattered. Sit down, Emmett. I'll stand. Sit down. Something in the tone made Drey sit. Because that was the other thing about Emmett Drey, that 4 years in Ashwater had trained everyone else not to notice. Underneath the fast hand, and the pale green eyes, and the reputation built on 9 graves, there was a man who took orders. Had always taken orders. From the trust, from Wexler, from whatever chain of command led back to Galveston, and further still, to men with names Drey had never once been told. He was an instrument. Had always been one. And instruments, Wexler understood better than Drey ever would, did not question the hand that held them. Not out loud, anyway. The stranger, Wexler said. Tell me about him. Fast. Faster than anyone I've faced. Maybe faster than me. That's not what I asked? Drey's jaw tightened. He knows guns. Not showy about it. Worn holster. Worn gun. The kind of wear that only comes from a man who's drawn that weapon more times than most men have drawn breath. A gunfighter, then. A hired one. No. Drey said it fast. Certain. Not hired. Hired men have a look. Money in their eyes. This one didn't have money in his eyes at all. A pause. He had something else. What? Drey was quiet a long moment. Purpose, he said finally. Wexler folded his hands a little tighter. Because that word, purpose, was not a word Wexler enjoyed hearing attached to a stranger who'd ridden into his town, faced down his best instrument, and walked away, without a scratch. Hired men could be paid off, redirected, sent elsewhere with enough money. Men with purpose were considerably harder to manage. Find out who he is, Wexler said. I intend to. Not with your gun, Emmett. Wexler's voice sharpened, just slightly, just enough. With your ears. Ask around. Find out where he's been. Find out what brought him to my town. A beat. And find out why Nora Voss looked at him the way 3 separate witnesses tell me she did. Drey stood. You had witnesses in the saloon. I have witnesses everywhere, Emmett. Wexler said it without malice. Simply a fact, the way a man states the weather. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked. Drey left without another word, and Wexler sat alone in the quiet, listening to boots fade down the boardwalk outside. He opened the drawer. The folded paper was still there. Still yellowed at the edges. Still bearing that single line, written a little, over 2 years back in a moment of caution Wexler had told himself, at the time, was probably unnecessary. Never fails to close a contract. He looked at it a long moment. Because here was the truth of Cornelius Wexler underneath the fine suit, and the careful hands, and the patient watching silence. He had not built an empire by trusting any single instrument completely. Not Drey. Not the judge on his payroll. Not the men in Galveston, who signed his checks. Trust, in Wexler's experience, was simply a word men used to describe a risk they hadn't yet bothered to price. He pulled a fresh sheet toward himself. Began to write. Dade Kessler, Fort Worth. Situation: Ashwater may require specialist attention. Retainer doubled for immediate travel if needed. Discretion essential. He paused. Pen hovering above the page. Because sending this, before Drey had even faced the stranger in the street, before anyone knew for certain how tomorrow's business would resolve, was, by any honest accounting, an act of profound disloyalty to the man who had served this trust faithfully for 4 straight years. Wexler did not hesitate long. He finished the telegram. Folded it. Called for his clerk, a thin, nervous young man named Purdy, who had learned, over 2 years of employment, never to ask questions about the errands Cornelius Wexler sent him on. "Send this from the wire office," Wexler said. "Hold it there. Don't dispatch unless I send word." "Yes, sir." And Purdy. "Sir. If Emmett Drey asks, you never came here." Purdy swallowed. Nodded. Left. And Cornelius Wexler sat alone in his office, watching the sun crawl toward the western hills, already several moves ahead of a man who had spent 4 years believing himself Ashwater's only necessary weapon. Because that was the thing about instruments, Wexler thought, settling back into his chair. Even the finest ones eventually got replaced. Simply a matter of timing. Ezra Combs pulled the bottom drawer open, that evening for the second time in 2 years, without pouring himself a drink first. Which, in itself, felt like the beginning of something. He sat behind his desk, with the office door shut, and the shades drawn, the letter unfolded under the low orange light of a single lamp, and he read Caleb Voss's careful handwriting for what must have been the 100th time. "The trust pays Judge Averill $400 a quarter. I have confirmed this, through the bank ledger, though I obtained it by means I would not care to explain to my superiors. The killings are not random. Each one clears title on land the trust needs. I believe Drey is instructed, not merely employed. I believe there is a name above his, and a name above that one, reaching further than Ashwater, further perhaps than Texas. If anything happens to me, before I can file this properly, I am trusting whoever finds it to understand that the truth, once written down, does not simply disappear, because the man who wrote it did." Combs set the letter down. His hands, he noticed, were shaking. Because 2 years he had told himself sending this letter meant certain death. 2 years he told himself Ashwater wasn't ready. That Austin wouldn't listen. That a marshal's badge in a town like this was worth exactly as much as the men holding the guns allowed it to be worth. Which was to say, nothing at all. But today a stranger had walked into the Silver Anchor and made Emmett Drey step backward for the first time in 4 years. Today Nora Voss had done the same, with nothing but a hammer and a voice that didn't shake. And something in Ezra Combs, something that had been asleep, so long he'd nearly forgotten it existed, had begun, faintly, unmistakably, to stir. He folded the letter back along its worn creases. This time, instead of returning it to the bottom of the drawer under the bottle, he set it inside his coat, close to his chest. Where a man keeps the things he isn't ready to lose again. Word travels fast in a small town. Faster, sometimes, than the truth can keep up with, twisting a little at every doorway it passes through, until by nightfall the story of what happened in the Silver Anchor had grown into something almost unrecognizable. In some versions the stranger had drawn on Drey, and missed on purpose. In others Nora Voss had threatened to burn the saloon down around all their heirs. In one particularly creative telling passed between 2 ranch hands over supper, the stranger was said to be a U.S. Marshal sent secretly from Washington itself. None of it was true. All of it carried, underneath the exaggeration, the same single fact that mattered. Something had shifted in Ashwater today. Something frozen solid for 4 years had, for one afternoon, cracked. And a town that had learned brutally how to survive under Drey's particular weather system spent that whole night lying awake in the dark, wondering what tomorrow's forecast might bring. Cole didn't sleep either. He'd taken a room at the boarding house on the edge of town, modest, clean, the kind of place a man could disappear into for a night, without drawing much notice, and he sat now on the narrow bed, with his boots off, and his gun belt hung careful over the bedpost, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Because sleep wasn't coming. Hadn't come easy in 2 years, if he was honest with himself, and tonight of all nights it felt further away than usual. He kept seeing her face. Nora's. The way something had moved behind her eyes, when she said Caleb's name out loud for what might have been the first time in months. The way grief and iron sat together in her, so easily it was like watching 2 different metals forged into the same blade. Which was dangerous. He knew that. Because a man riding a debt like his had no business letting anything else take up room in his chest. No business at all. The debt was supposed to be the only thing. Simple. Clean. Find the men responsible. Settle the account. Ride on. Except nothing about today had felt simple. Except every time he closed his eyes he saw her walk into that doorway, hammer at her side, and something in his chest had done a thing he didn't have a name for, and wasn't sure he wanted one. Cole sat up. Ran a hand down his face. Enough, he told himself. Tomorrow there'd be a reckoning in the street, one way or another, and a man couldn't afford to walk into that kind of business, with his mind split two directions at once. Tomorrow was Drey. Tomorrow was Caleb. Tomorrow was the only thing that mattered. He almost believed himself. Drey spent that same night the way he'd spent the night before every gunfight in 4 years. Awake. Sober. Methodical. Going through the small rituals that had never once failed him. He cleaned the Remington twice. Checked the timing on the cylinder, though he'd had it checked by the same San Antonio gunsmith 2 months back, and knew there was nothing wrong with it. Sat by the window of his rented room, and watched the dark street below, empty and quiet, the way it always was, the way he trained it to be. Except tonight something gnawed at him, that had never gnawed before. Because in 4 years, Emmett Drey had never once lain awake wondering about an opponent's name. Names didn't matter. Names belonged to men, who died the same way every other man died. Fast. Clean. Legal. What mattered was the draw. The timing. The 8 feet of dirt between two men in the noon sun. Tonight he wondered anyway. Who are you? Where'd you learn to hold a gun like that? And why, when I looked in your eyes across that bar, did something in me, something that has never once flinched in 4 years, flinch? He didn't have answers. Which unsettled him more than any answer could have. Around midnight, a soft knock came at his door. Drey's hand found the Remington, before his mind had even finished registering the sound. "It's Purdy," came a voice from the hall. Thin. Nervous. Drey opened the door a crack. The trust clerk stood there, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Wexler wanted you informed," Purdy said, not quite meeting Drey's eyes. "Word came back, from the county office this afternoon. Checked the brand on the stranger's horse. And Dark Bay gelding. Brands from a ranger remount station out of Austin." Purdy swallowed. "Retired stock. Sold off 2 years back." Drey stood very still. 2 years, he repeated. "Yes, sir." Drey said nothing else. Simply shut the door, slow, careful, and stood alone in the dark of his room, with a piece of information settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. 2 years. The same 2 years since a Texas Ranger named Caleb Voss had died in a card game that Drey himself had personally, carefully, arranged. For the first time in 4 years, Emmett Drey, killer of 9 men, terror of an entire basin, instrument of the Sable Ridge Land Trust, felt something crawl up the back of his neck that he did not have a comfortable word for. He would not have called it fear. He would have been lying. Morning came to Ashwater the way it always did. Slow, then all at once, gray lights sliding over the eastern hills, and catching first on the church steeple, then the mercantile roof, then finally down into the street itself, waking the town one rooftop at a time. Cole was already up, before the first light reached the boarding house window. Had been up, in truth, for most of the night, sitting in the dark turning things over that had no easy shape to them. He dressed slow. Checked the Colt, every chamber, the way he'd checked it 10,000 times before, the way the habit had worn itself so deep into his hands that his fingers moved through the ritual without needing his mind's permission. He thought about riding out. Just for a moment. Just long enough to feel the shape of the idea in his chest. What it would mean to saddle the gelding and put Ashwater behind him the way he'd put a dozen other towns behind him, over 2 hard years, none of them the right one, none of them holding the answer he was looking for. except this one held Drey. And Drey had been standing in that saloon 4 years running, drawing his gun on men who never had a chance, and somewhere underneath that particular brand of violence sat the truth about a card game 2 years gone. A truth that had cost Caleb Voss his life. Cost Nora Voss her husband. Cost Ezra Combs whatever was left of his nerve. Cole was not riding out. He finished dressing. Walked downstairs. Ate nothing, because his stomach wasn't interested in food this morning, and stepped out, into a street already beginning to fill with the particular tension of a town that sensed, correctly, that today would not be an ordinary day. Drey found him an hour later, standing near the mercantile, and this time there was no saloon, no careful build-up, no room full of witnesses to perform for. Just two men on a dirt street in the early light. "You've had a night to think," Drey said. "So vi." Cole didn't answer. "Found out something interesting," Drey went on, circling now, slow, the way a predator circles, when it's decided the hunt is nearly finished. "That horse of yours. Ranger stock. Retired 2 years back." Still nothing from Cole. His face didn't move. 2 years, Drey said again, softer this time. "Same as a ranger, who died in my saloon, over a card game. He didn't cheat." The words came out of Cole, before he decided to say them, flat and hard, and for a moment something like satisfaction crossed Drey's face, because now he had a thread, and Drey had learned, over 4 careful years, exactly what to do with threads. "No," Drey agreed. "He didn't." Cole's hand had gone very still at his side. "You knew him," Drey said. "I knew him. Trained him. Rode with him. Something like that." Drey's pale green eyes studied Cole's face the way a man studies a hand of cards he suspects is better than his own. "And 2 years later, here you are. Here I am. That's not a coincidence I can afford to ignore. Wasn't meant to be ignored." The two men stood there in the growing light, 8 feet between them exactly, though either had consciously chosen the distance. Some old instinct in both of them had simply found the number, and settled there. "You came here to kill me," Drey said. "Not a question. I came here for the truth. Same thing most days." Cole's jaw tightened, the smallest movement, but Drey caught it. Filed it away. "Here's what I don't understand," Drey said, and for the first time in 4 years something in his voice carried a note that wasn't calculation. Wasn't performance. Something closer, though he'd never have admitted it, to genuine uncertainty. "I've killed 9 men in this town. Every one of them reached first. Every one of them made a choice I didn't make for them. 9th one didn't reach for anything," Cole said. "9th one was murdered, over a card table by a cowhand you put up to it." Silence. Because that landed somewhere true, somewhere Drey had spent 2 years not looking at too closely, and for one bare second his composure, that careful, practiced, unbreakable composure, cracked wide enough for Cole to see straight through it. "You don't know what you're talking about," Drey said, but the words came out thinner than he meant them to. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Cole took 1 step forward. "Just one. I know a ranger named Caleb Voss rode into this town to investigate 9 convenient deaths, and a land trust, with too much money. I know he spent 4 days building a case nobody in Austin ever saw, because it died with him. And I know the man who arranged that card game, the man who stood up in that room and said whatever he needed to say to turn a dead man's memory into a lie. That man is standing 8 feet in front of me right now." Drey's hand hovered near the Remington. "Didn't draw." "Not yet." "Careful," he said. "I've been careful for 2 years," Cole said. "Careful's what got me here." Behind the mercantile window, half hidden by a display of canned goods, Duke Farrow watched the whole exchange, with his hands pressed flat against the glass, and felt his stomach drop straight through the floorboards. Because he recognized this. Had seen this shape before. The distance, the stillness, the particular quality of silence, that meant words had run their course, and something else was about to take over. He turned. Ran. Not toward the confrontation. Toward the marshal's office. "Marshal." He hit the door, so hard it nearly came off its hinges. Marshal there. Out on Main Street. Drey and the stranger there. Combs was already moving. Coat half on, shotgun already in hand, the letter still tucked close against his chest, where he'd kept it, since the night before, and something in his face had changed, since yesterday, something Duke, in the panic of the moment, didn't quite have time to notice. He was afraid. But he was moving anyway. By the time Combs reached the street, half of Ashwater had already gathered along the boardwalks, pressed into doorways, peering out from behind rain barrels, and hitching posts, the whole town drawn out by the same old, terrible instinct that pulls people toward violence even, as every part of them screams to look away. Nora Voss was among them. She'd come running from the forge the second word reached her, carried, of all people, by Amos Teague, who'd taken to standing watch near the mercantile most mornings, since yesterday's business, some old instinct sensing that Ashwater wasn't finished yet. She pushed through the gathering crowd, until she found a spot near the front, close enough to see everything, close enough that her chest tightened watching Cole and Drey squared off in the street, with a geometry that only ever meant one thing. Because she knew this too. Had learned it the hard way, 2 years back, standing in a doorway not so different from this one, waiting for news that never came the way she'd prayed it would. Not again, she thought. Please. Not again. But some things, once set into motion, don't stop for prayer. Last chance, Drey said, and his voice had found its old register again, cold and final, though something underneath it now carried a tremor that hadn't been there yesterday. Ride out. Take your horse, and go, and I'll let this be. New. Drey had never offered an exit before. Not once in 4 years, not to any of the 9 men who'd faced him in this same street. Exits weren't the point. The point had always been the demonstration, irreversible, absolute, the kind of lesson a whole town could watch and understand without needing it explained twice. But something had shifted in the careful architecture of Emmett Drey's mind since last night, some doubt he couldn't name settling into machinery that had run so smooth for so long, and the offer, when it came, was the strange, involuntary expression of that doubt. Cole looked at him. No, he said. One word. Quiet as a closing door. And Drey drew. It was, by every account given afterward by every soul standing on that street, the fastest draw any of them had ever witnessed. Faster even than the day Jonas Pruitt made his fatal mistake 4 years back. The Remington cleared leather in a single explosive motion, ivory grip catching morning light for one bright fraction of a second, as the barrel swept level, hammer already back, trigger finger already moving. Cole moved at what looked, to every eye on that street, like the exact same instant. Not before. Not in anticipation. In the same breath of compressed time. But where Drey's hand lifted the weapon toward eye level, toward the careful, practiced sight picture that had never once failed him, Cole's hand did something different entirely. The Colt cleared its worn holster low, at the hip, the same downward-outward roll the leather had been shaped by 10,000 repetitions to demand, and fired from there. No pause at the chest. No rising toward the eye. Just a straight, unbroken line from hip to target, covered in less time than it took Drey's barrel to finish its rise. The shots cracked, as one sound to every ear on that street. Black powder smoke bloomed thick, and gray between them, swallowing both men whole for 3 long, terrible seconds while the whole town held its breath, and the echo rolled off the storefronts, and faded into flat morning silence. The smoke drifted east on a thin, hot wind. Drey's arm was still extended. Eye level. His sight picture, for one final instant, perfect, the barrel aimed dead center at Cole's chest, his finger already curled around a trigger that had not yet released. The bullet from that barrel struck 3 feet wide, burying itself in the wall of the mercantile behind Cole's shoulder. Because in the exact instant Cole's shot found him, Drey's whole right side convulsed with the impact. A .45 caliber slug entering 2 inches left of his sternum at close to 900 feet per second. the muscular spasm jerking the barrel a fraction of a degree left at the precise moment the trigger finally broke. Drey's arm dropped. The Remington hit the dirt, with a soft, final thud. He looked down. At the dark stain already spreading across the front of his shirt, soaking through waistcoat and collar with a terrible, patient deliberateness. He pressed his free hand against it. Looked at his palm. Looked up at Cole, with an expression no one in that street had ever seen on his face before. The specific, uncomprehending confusion of a man confronting information that shattered his most fundamental belief about the shape of the world. His knees went. First to the ground. Then forward, hands finding the dirt, and then whatever strength remained simply left him all at once, and Emmett Drey lay still in the packed earth of Ashwater's main street, the white morning sun hard on his face, the dust of the whole basin rising slow and pale around him. Cole held his position. Colt still extended, from the hip, smoke curling thin, from the muzzle, eyes fixed on the man, who had, for years running, made this entire town learn how to disappear into its own boots. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. Drey didn't move again. Cole lowered the Colt slow. Thumbed the hammer back down. Started, finally, to breathe. And that was the exact moment, that half-second of release, of a debt 2 years carried finally beginning, at last, to settle, that the second shot came. Not from the street. From above. A sharp crack, from the rooftop of the Mercantile, from somewhere behind the false front, where a man could lie flat against the shingles, and never once be seen, from below, and the bullet cut the air, with a whine that every soul on that street would remember for the rest of their lives, a sound too fast, and too final to duck from, aimed dead center at the space, where Cole stood, with his gun still half raised. Cole didn't see it coming. Nora did. She was already moving, before her mind had finished processing what her eyes had caught. A glint of metal on the rooftop. Wrong. Out of place. A shape that didn't belong among the shingles. And 2 years of grief, an iron-forged strength carried her across that street faster than anyone watching would have believed a person her size could move. She hit Cole from the side. Full weight, full force, driving him down, and sideways into the dirt an instant, before the bullet meant for his chest tore through the space where he'd been standing. And found her instead. The impact spun her. A cry tore out of her, sharp, sudden, cut off almost, as fast as it started, and she went down hard in the dust beside Cole, one hand pressed instinctively to her upper arm, where the bullet had opened a furrow of blood already soaking dark through her sleeve. For one endless, ringing second, the whole street stood frozen. Then chaos. Screaming from the boardwalk. Amos Teague diving for cover behind the same rain barrel he'd hidden behind the day before. Marshal Combs shouting something lost in the noise, shotgun already coming up toward the Mercantile roof. Duke Farrow, halfway out the saloon doors, frozen mid-step. And Cole. Cole was moving before any of it registered, rolling up onto his knees beside Nora, hands finding her shoulder, her arm, pressing hard against the wound, with a steadiness that came from somewhere deep and practiced. Some old training that hadn't left him even now. Nora. His voice cracked on her name in a way it hadn't cracked on anything in 2 years. Nora, look at me. Look at me. Her eyes found his. Pain glazed but present. Furious. Told you, she managed, through gritted teeth, this town wasn't finished with you yet. Don't talk. Wasn't asking permission. Somewhere above them, on the Mercantile roof, a shape moved fast and low along the shingles, scrambling toward the back of the building, toward a rope, or a ladder, or whatever escape had been arranged in advance by a man careful enough to plan for exactly this contingency. Cole's head snapped up. Eyes hard, cold, tracking the movement. Stay with her, he said to Combs, who'd finally reached them, shotgun still raised, face white as bone. Cole. Stay with her. And then Judah Cole was up, and running, Colt already back in his hand, chasing a shape across a rooftop that had no business existing in a fight that was supposed to have already ended. Because Ashwater, it was becoming clear to everyone standing frozen in that street with the smell of gunpowder still hanging thick in the morning air, had never been fighting one gun. It had been fighting a machine. And machines, unlike men, always kept a second part in reserve. He hit the alley beside the mercantile at a dead run. Found the ladder the shooter had used, propped careless against the back wall, left there by a man who'd planned his arrival, but never once planned on being chased. Cole took the rungs 2 at a time, Colt already in hand, breath coming hard and fast in his chest. Because there wasn't time to think. Which was fine. Cole had stopped needing time to think somewhere around the 2nd year of riding alone, with nothing but a promise, and a horse for company. His body knew what to do even when his mind was 3 steps behind, screaming Nora's name over and over in some locked room at the back of his skull that he didn't have space to visit right now. He came up, over the roofline low and fast. The shooter was already 20 feet ahead, scrambling toward the far edge, where the mercantile roof met the narrow gap to the next building over. A jump most men wouldn't attempt, but a man running for his life doesn't measure distances the same way a man standing still does. Stop, Cole said. The shooter didn't stop. Cole fired once, low, into the shingles just ahead of the man's next step, close enough to shatter wood, and send splinters flying, and that got the man's attention in a way words hadn't managed. He froze. Turned. A young man. Younger than Cole expected. Maybe 25. Hollow-cheeked. The particular hungry leanness of a man who took jobs like this, because jobs like this were the only ones that paid enough to matter. Don't, the man said, both hands going up slow, rifle already dropped somewhere behind him on the shingles. Don't shoot. I'm done. I'm done, I swear it. Who sent you? I don't. Who? Cole took a step closer. The Colt didn't waver. A woman's bleeding in that street because of you. You're going to tell me who sent you up here, or I'm going to stop asking nice. The man's eyes darted, searching for an exit that didn't exist, and found none. Wexler, he said finally, voice cracking. Man from the trust office. Told me 2 days back, if things went bad with the stranger, I was to be ready. Just in case. 2 days back. The words landed in Cole's chest like a second bullet. 2 days, Cole repeated. Before the fight ever happened. Yes. Which meant Wexler had never once fully believed in Drey. Not really. Not the way the whole town had been trained to believe in him. Wexler had hedged his bet the moment Cole rode into Ashwater, planning for Drey's death, before Drey himself had any notion it was coming. Cole felt something cold settle into his chest, replacing the panic with something harder, more useful. Because this wasn't just about one killer anymore. This was a machine. And machines didn't stop just because one gear broke. Down in the street, Ezra Combs knelt in the dirt beside Nora, with his coat pressed hard against her arm, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Ezra Combs felt something other than the particular numbness that had carried him through the last 4 years. He felt useful. Which surprised him. Which, in some small corner of his chest, felt almost like shame. That it had taken a woman bleeding in the street to remind him what the badge on his coat was supposed to mean. Easy, he said, voice rough. Easy now, Nora. Bleeding's bad, but it's not deep. You're going to be just fine. Don't you dare, Nora managed through gritted teeth, tell me I'm fine, when I can feel exactly how not fine this is. Ma'am, I'm trying to. I know what you're trying to do. Her eyes found his, hard even through the pain. You're trying to be brave for the both of us. Little late for that, Marshal. Little late by about 4 years. The words landed exactly where she meant them to. Combs said nothing. Just pressed harder against the wound, jaw tight, and something in his chest that had been asleep a long, long time finally, fully woke up. Duke arrived moments later, with a strip of clean linen torn from behind the bar, hands shaking as he helped bind the wound tight. Amos Teague hovered nearby, hat off, face gray with the particular helplessness of an old man watching violence he was too slow now to prevent. She needs a doctor, Duke said. Nearest one's 2 hours out, Combs said. Ranch doctor at the Barquet spread. Then somebody rides. I'll ride, Amos said, already moving toward his own horse tied nearby, 70 years old, and moving like a man half that age, because urgency does that to people sometimes. Burns away the years for exactly as long as they're needed. Nora grabbed Combs's sleeve. Hard. Her grip, even wounded, still carried the strength of 2 years hammering iron. Drey, she said. Combs glanced toward the body still lying in the dirt, 20 feet off, unmoving under the white morning sun. Dead, he said. Cole's shot took him clean. And the rooftop. As if in answer, a figure appeared at the edge of the mercantile roof above them. Cole, pushing a young man ahead of him at gunpoint, both of them climbing down the same ladder the shooter had used to get up there. Alive, Cole said, jumping the last few feet to the ground, dragging his prisoner with him. For now. He crossed to Nora immediately, gun still trained loose on the captured shooter, but his eyes only for her, and something passed across his face he didn't bother hiding this time. Not from her. Not from the whole gathered street watching. You shouldn't have done that, he said. Voice low. Rough. Somebody had to. Could have gotten yourself killed. Could have watched you get killed instead. Her jaw tightened against the pain. Wasn't going to happen twice in one lifetime, Mr. Cole. Once was already more than I could carry. Cole's throat worked. He didn't say anything else. Just reached out, careful, and pressed his hand briefly against hers, where it lay in the dirt, and for one small moment neither of them cared that half the town was watching. They took the shooter to the jail. Combs, for the first time in longer than he could remember, locked the cell door himself instead of leaving it for someone else. Someone braver. Someone who hadn't already surrendered his nerve years back. Name, Cole said, standing outside the bars. Whitlock. Cyrus Whitlock. Whitlock, you're going to tell the marshal here everything you told me on that rooftop. Word for word. And then you're going to write it down, and sign it, because the man who paid you is about to find out that hiring cheap doesn't buy loyal. Whitlock, hollow-eyed and shaking, nodded fast. He'll kill me, he said. Wexler. If he finds out I talked. He'll have bigger problems than you by the time this is finished, Cole said. Trust me on that. He turned to leave. Stopped at the door. Looked back at Combs, who stood there, with something new sitting behind his tired eyes. A straightness in his spine that hadn't been there yesterday. You all right, Marshal? Combs was quiet a moment. Then reached inside his coat, and pulled out the folded letter, worn soft at the creases, from 2 years of careful handling. I've been sitting on something, he said. 2 years now. Cole waited. Letter from Caleb Voss, Combs said. Written the night before he died. Everything he knew about the trust. The judge. The payments. His voice caught. Steadied. I was scared to send it. Scared what it'd cost me if I did. Cole crossed the room. Took the letter, carefully, and read it in silence, while Combs stood there like a man confessing to a sin he'd carried, so long it had become part of his skeleton. When Cole finished, he looked up. This changes everything, he said. I know. Why now? Combs looked at the letter in Cole's hands. At the cell where Whitlock sat trembling. At the window, through which the whole street was visible, still buzzing with the aftermath of gunfire and blood. Because I watched a woman twice my size, and half my courage throw herself in front of a bullet yesterday, Combs said. And I watched a stranger ride into my town and do what I should have done 4 years ago. And I figured. His voice caught again. Held this time. I figured it was about time I remembered what this badge was supposed to mean. Word of the letter spread through Ashwater the way water spreads through dry ground. Slow at first, then all at once, soaking into every corner, until by early afternoon there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't heard, in one version or another, that Marshal Combs had proof. Real proof. Written proof, in a dead ranger's own hand, naming names. The mercantile owner, a quiet man named Silas Farr who'd kept his head down for 4 straight years, was the first to walk into the marshal's office and offer to testify about payments the trust had forced him to make under threat of losing his supply contracts. He wasn't the last. By evening, a line had formed outside Combs's door. Ranchers, shopkeepers, men and women who'd spent 4 years learning silence as a survival skill and had, in the space of one single violent morning, remembered they had voices at all. Combs sat behind his desk taking statement after statement, hand cramping around a pen he hadn't used this much in years, and felt something in his chest loosen with every single testimony. Like a knot 4 years in the tying finally starting, thread by careful thread, to come undone. Nora recovered at the boarding house, the ranch doctor having arrived by late afternoon to clean and properly dress the wound, declaring, with the gruff satisfaction of a man who'd seen far worse, that she'd carry a scar, but keep full use of the arm, provided she didn't go throwing herself in front of any more bullets in the meantime. No promises, Nora told him, which earned her a tired laugh from the doctor and a considerably less amused look from Cole, who'd barely left her doorway since the shooting. He sat now in a chair pulled close to her bed, hat in his lap, turning it slowly between his hands the way a man does when his hands need something to do, and his mind is somewhere he doesn't entirely want it to be. "You keep doing that," Nora said. "You're going to wear a hole clean through that hat." Cole stopped. Looked up. "Sorry. Wasn't a complaint. Just an observation." She shifted against the pillow, wincing slightly. "You've had that look on your face since the street." "What is it?" Cole was quiet a long moment. "Whitlock said Wexler paid him 2 days ago," he said finally. "Before the fight ever happened. Before anybody knew how it'd end." Nora's eyes sharpened despite the pain clouding them. "Meaning he never trusted Drey. Meaning Drey spent 4 years being the most feared man in this basin, and the whole time, somewhere in a locked drawer in that office, there was already a name ready in case he was gone." Cole's jaw tightened. "Man like that. Wexler. He doesn't gamble on loyalty. Doesn't gamble on anything. Whatever comes next, he's already thought 3 moves ahead of it. You think there's more coming? I know there's more coming. He didn't say how he knew. Didn't need to. Some part of both of them had already understood, since the moment Whitlock said the name Wexler on that rooftop, that Ashwater's morning of reckoning had settled one account, and left at least one more standing open. Cornelius Wexler received the news of Drey's death, and the subsequent capture of his hired shooter, in the particular controlled silence of a man who has planned for failure, so thoroughly that failure, when it finally arrives, barely registers as surprise. He sat in his office long, after the sun went down, a single lamp burning low, and read through the accumulating reports from his own network of informants scattered through the town. Combs collecting statements. The mercantile owner talking. A whole town, for years silent, suddenly finding its voice all at once. This was, Wexler understood with the cold clarity of a man who had built and lost fortunes before a collapse. Not a setback. A collapse, the kind that once it started rarely stopped, until everything underneath it had come down with it. He pulled the drawer open. Took out the folded paper, with its single line, still waiting, patient, exactly where he'd left it. He pulled a fresh telegram form toward himself. Dade Kessler. Situation deteriorated. Immediate arrival required. Target is former Texas Ranger, goes by Cole. You will know the name. He stopped writing. Sat back. You will know the name. Because Wexler had done his research, when he'd first written that name down, on who Dade Kessler had been, before he became a hired gun out of Fort Worth. Knew he'd worn a ranger's badge himself once, in the same company, as a man named Judah Cole, and a man named Caleb Voss, before something had happened between the 3 of them, that Wexler's sources had never fully explained. Only that Kessler had left the Rangers under a cloud, and that cloud had followed him for years afterward, and that somewhere in That unexplained history sat a debt Wexler now intended to collect on in the most useful way possible. He finished the telegram, sent it before dawn, and began, methodically, to prepare for the possibility that Ashwater, for years of careful, patient investment, might already be a loss he needed to cut. The telegram found Dade Kessler in a Fort Worth saloon 2 days later, delivered by a boy, who didn't ask questions, and didn't wait for a tip, and Kessler read it twice, through before folding it slow, and setting it on the bar in front of him. He was lean, maybe 35. A face that had learned, over years of hard living, to give away exactly nothing it didn't intend to. Dark hair going gray early at the temples. A scar along his jaw that had a story nobody in Fort Worth had ever heard him tell. He read the name again. Cole. Something moved behind his eyes that hadn't moved in a long time. Not guilt exactly. Dade Kessler had buried guilt, so deep and so long ago he wasn't entirely sure he still had access to it. But something close. Something that felt, if he was honest, with himself, uncomfortably like the past finally catching up to a debt he'd assumed, incorrectly, he had outrun. He finished his whiskey, set the glass down, and began, without any particular hurry, to pack for a job that felt, for the first time in years, less like business, and more like something he'd been waiting on, without ever quite admitting it. Back in Ashwater, 3 days after the shooting, Nora was up, and moving again, slower than usual, the arms still bound tight, but moving, because Nora Voss was not a woman built for lying still any longer than her body absolutely demanded. She found Cole outside her forge in the early evening, sitting on an overturned crate, watching the last light fade gold over the western hills. "You've been quiet," she said, easing herself down onto the crate beside him, careful of the arm. "Thinking. About Wexler. About all of it." Cole was quiet a moment longer. "Caleb used to say something. Back when we were training together, before either of us wore the badge for real. He'd say a debt like this, the kind you carry for somebody you loved, it doesn't ever really finish. You just get to a point where you've paid enough of it, that you can breathe again. Have you gotten there?" Cole looked at her. Really looked, the way he hadn't quite let himself, since the morning in the street, since the moment fear for her had cracked something open in his chest, that 2 years of careful distance hadn't managed to touch. "Getting closer," he said. "Don't know if I'm there yet." Nora studied him a long moment, something soft moving underneath the hardness she usually carried. "For what it's worth," she said, "you already did more for this town in 3 days than 4 years of waiting ever managed." "Wasn't just me." "No," she agreed, a small, tired smile finding its way onto her face. "Wasn't just you." They sat there a while longer in the fading light, saying nothing, and for a small stretch of that quiet evening, Ashwater felt, for the first time in 4 years, almost like an ordinary town again. It wouldn't last. Dade Kessler rode into Ashwater 8 days after the telegram found him, arriving in the gray hour just before full dark, and something about the way he entered town, unhurried, deliberate, his horse's hooves striking the packed dirt in a rhythm too even to be careless, told the handful of people who noticed him that this was not a man passing through. He went straight to the Sable Ridge office. Wexler received him alone, and studied the man across from him with the particular careful attention of someone assessing whether the money spent had bought what he needed. "Mr. Kessler? Mr. Wexler? You know the man you're here for?" "I know him." Kessler's voice carried no particular weight, no obvious feeling one way or another, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes that a less careful observer might have missed entirely. "Judah Cole. Rode with him 3 years. Rode with a man named Caleb Voss too, before that." A pause. "Heard Voss died in this town. Card game, way I heard it told. That's the official record. And the unofficial one." Wexler folded his hands. "The unofficial record is considerably more complicated, and considerably less your concern than simply finishing the job you were paid to finish." Kessler's jaw tightened, just slightly, and for one bare moment something almost like discomfort crossed his face, before he smoothed it back into the careful blankness he'd worn into the room. When do you want it done? Soon, Wexler said. This town is coming apart at the seams, Mr. Kessler, faster than I'd like. I need this finished, before whatever's building in that marshal's office finds a way to reach Austin. And the woman? The blacksmith. Leave her be, unless she interferes directly. I've had enough complications from unnecessary casualties. Wexler's eyes were flat, calculating. Cole is the priority. Once he's gone, this town's resistance dies with him. People like Combs, like Voss's widow, they need a symbol to rally behind. Remove the symbol, and the rest falls back in line the way it always has. Kessler was quiet a moment. You're sure about that, he said. I'm sure of very little these days, Wexler admitted, with the closest thing to honesty he'd shown anyone in years. But I'm sure enough to have brought you 200 miles on a moment's notice. Don't disappoint me the way Drey did. Kessler stood. Adjusted his hat. Drey, he said, never knew who he was up against. And you do. I trained beside him. A pause, something old and unresolved sitting heavy in the words. I know exactly who I'm up against. News that a new gunman had arrived reached Cole, within hours, carried by Duke Farrow, who'd overheard enough at the Silver Anchor Bar to piece together the shape of things, before most of the town had even noticed the stranger ride in. Man staying at the boarding house on the East End, Duke said, breathless from the walk to the forge. Quiet. Careful. Asked after you by name, Mr. Cole. Not description. Name. Cole went very still. What name? Judah Cole. Said it plain, like he already knew exactly who he was looking for. Nora, standing nearby with her arms still bound, watched something pass across Cole's face that she hadn't seen there before. Not fear exactly, Cole didn't seem built for fear the way most men were, but something colder. Something that looked, for just a moment, like recognition arriving, before the facts had even confirmed themselves. Describe him, Cole said. Duke did his best. The lean build. The gray already showing early at the temples. The scar along the jaw that, by Duke's account, the man made no particular effort to hide. Cole closed his eyes. Kessler, he said, quiet. Almost to himself. You know him, Nora said. Rode with him. Same company as Caleb, before either of us made Ranger full rank. Cole's voice had gone flat, careful, the sound of a man working hard to keep something contained, that wanted very badly to break loose. Dade Kessler was the third man in our unit. Trained beside us both. Watched each other's backs through 2 years of hard country. What happened to him? Cole was quiet a long moment. Money happened to him, he said finally. Or maybe money was just the excuse. Kessler left the Rangers a year and a half before Caleb died. Said the pay wasn't worth the risk anymore. Started taking work from anybody willing to pay for a fast gun and a quiet conscience. A beat. I always figured he was just gone. Somewhere else. Some other territory, some other job. You didn't figure he'd end up here. No, Cole said. I didn't figure that at all. That night, alone in his room at the boarding house, Cole sat with the lamp burned low, and turned something over in his mind that he hadn't let himself fully consider until now. Because there was a piece of this that didn't fit. A piece that had been sitting wrong in his chest since the moment Duke said Kessler's name, small and cold, and impossible to ignore. Kessler had left the Rangers a year and a half before Caleb died. Which put him gone. Working other jobs, some other territory. Except Cole had never actually confirmed where those months had taken him. Had simply assumed, the way a man assumes about an old friend, who drifts away, that distance meant disconnection, that gone meant gone. What if it didn't? What if Kessler, months into his new life, as a hired gun, had still had contacts? Still had ears in places a working ranger's ears couldn't reach? What if the information that led a drunk cowhand to pick a fight with an unarmed ranger in a saloon 2 years back, information about Caleb Voss's arrival, his schedule, his habits, the exact night he'd be vulnerable. What if that information hadn't come from Drey's own careful watching after all? What if it had come from someone who already knew Caleb? Someone who knew his patterns, his weaknesses, the particular blind spot every good man carries, when he trusts an old friend's silence over his own instincts. Cole sat very still in the lamplight, the thought settling into his chest like a stone dropped into water that never quite stopped rippling. He didn't know it for certain. Not yet. But he intended to find out. Tomorrow. In the only language men like Kessler had ever fully understood. Morning found Ashwater changed in ways 4 years of Drey's shadow had never allowed. Combs stood outside his office at dawn, letter in hand, and read Caleb Voss's testimony aloud to a crowd that had gathered. Not summoned. Not ordered. Simply gathered the way people gather, when word travels, that something true is finally about to be said out loud. The trust pays Judge Averill $400 a quarter, Combs read, his voice carrying steady across the street. The killings are not random. Each one clears title on land the trust needs. Silence. The particular silence of a town hearing, at last, the shape of the cage it had been living inside. I've sat on this letter 2 years, Combs said, folding it closed, looking out at faces he'd known his whole career, faces that had trusted him once, and had every right, these past 4 years, to stop. That's my failure, and I'll carry it. But it ends today. I'm writing for Austin myself, with this letter, and every statement collected this week, and I'm not stopping till somebody, with the authority to act on it, reads every word. A murmur moved through the crowd. Something that, in a town starved 4 years for hope, sounded almost like the beginning of cheering. Nora stood near the front, arms still bound, watching Combs with something like pride settling into her tired face. Cole stood beside her. Neither of them said anything. Didn't need to. Because both of them understood, standing there in that gathering crowd, that this reclaimed voice, this town finally speaking, was worth more than any single gunfight could ever be. But it wasn't finished. Not yet. Because somewhere on the east end of town, a man named Dade Kessler was waking up, with a job to finish, and Cornelius Wexler was watching this same crowd, from his office window, with the particular cold calculation of a man deciding, finally, how much more he was willing to lose, before cutting every remaining thread. Wexler made his decision by noon. He summoned Purdy, and dictated instructions in a voice gone flat and final. Prepare the strongbox. All the account ledgers, the correspondence with Galveston, everything that could tie the trust directly to the judge's payments. He paused. We're leaving tonight. Before Combs reaches Austin. Sir, the Kessler matter. Kessler will finish his business or he won't. Either way, I don't intend to be here to find out which. Wexler's pale eyes were cold, resigned in the particular way of a man who had built and abandoned enterprises before and understood, better than most, exactly when the cost of staying finally outweighed the value of what remained. This basin was never worth my life, Purdy. Only my money. And money, unlike men, can always be made again elsewhere. He began, methodically, packing what mattered and abandoning what didn't. Kessler found Cole that afternoon. Not in a saloon. Not with witnesses gathered for a performance. On the open road just south of town, where Cole had ridden out alone to clear his head before whatever came next. Kessler sat his horse in the middle of the road, blocking the way, and Cole reined up 30 feet off, recognizing the shape of him even before the face came fully clear in the afternoon light. Judah. Dade. 2 old friends, or what used to be friends, sitting horseback in the dust, with 30 feet of empty road between them, and years of unspoken history crowding every inch of that distance. You've changed, Cole said. Everybody changes. Kessler's voice carried none of the warmth Cole remembered, from 3 hard years riding together, only a flat, careful distance, the sound of a man who'd spent a long time building walls he had no intention of taking down now. You look like a man who's been carrying something heavy a long while. I have been. Caleb. Cole's jaw tightened. You know. I know Wexler's paying me to finish what Drey started. I know you rode into this town chasing a ghost. Kessler's eyes were unreadable. Didn't figure the ghost would be me you found waiting at the end of it. Wasn't looking for you, Cole said. Was looking for whoever fed information to the men who set Caleb up. Whoever knew his patterns well enough to arrange a card game that got him killed over nothing at all. Silence. Long, heavy. The kind of silence that answers a question better than words ever could. You knew, Cole said. Voice gone quiet. Dangerous. You knew his schedule. His habits. The exact night he'd be alone in that saloon with nobody watching his back. I didn't pull the trigger. Didn't have to. Cole's hands had gone very still on his reins. You sold the information that got him killed. To who, Dade? Who paid you for that? Kessler was quiet a long moment, something moving behind his careful mask that looked, for just a fraction of a second, almost like the man Cole used to know. Man from the trust, he said finally. 2 years back. Offered good money for information on a ranger sniffing around their business. I told myself it was just information. Told myself whatever happened after wasn't my doing. His jaw tightened. Told myself a lot of things these 2 years. He was our friend. He was. Kessler's voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. And I've had 2 years to live, with what that cost me, Judah. Don't figure you telling me now is going to add much I haven't already carried. Then why are you here? Because Wexler's paying triple what Drey's contract was worth, and because a man's got to eat, and because... He stopped. Something raw crossing his face for one bare, unguarded second. Because some part of me figured, if it had to be somebody, better it was somebody, who at least understood what he was taking from you. Cole's hand moved, slow, toward the Colt at his hip. That's supposed to make this easier. No, Kessler said. Wasn't meant to make anything easier. Just meant to be honest, one last time, before we settle this the only way men like us ever really settle anything. He turned his horse. Rode back toward town without another word. Cole sat alone on that empty road along, while afterward, the weight of 2 years of grief, and 2 more of hard riding settling into his chest all at once, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like peace, exactly what tomorrow was going to require of him. That night, Cole told Nora everything. She listened in silence, sitting across from him at the small table in her cabin behind the forge, the lamp between them burning low and steady, and when he finished, she reached across and took his hand, without saying anything for a long moment. You don't have to do this alone, she said finally. I do, though. Cole's voice was quiet. Certain. This isn't your fight to finish, Nora. Isn't Combs's either, not this part. Kessler and I, we've got 2 years of unfinished business between us, and Caleb's sitting right in the middle of every hour of it. This one's mine. That's a lonely way to carry something. Been carrying it alone a long while already. He looked at her, something soft moving behind the hard gray of his eyes. Doesn't mean I don't feel less alone, having you beside me the rest of the time. Nora's hand tightened around his. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Cole agreed. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, over Ashwater, and somewhere across town, in a rented room, with a lamp burned low, Dade Kessler cleaned a Colt he hadn't drawn in anger in longer than he cared to count, and thought about a friend he'd betrayed 2 years back, and wondered, without much hope of an answer, whether a man could ever really pay off a debt like that, or whether some debts simply waited, patient as weather, for the day they finally came due. Morning broke clear and hard over Ashwater, the sky scrubbed pale blue, the heat already building by the time the town began to stir. Word had spread overnight, the way it always did in a place this small, that the stranger and the man from Fort Worth had unfinished business, and that today, one way or another, that business would be settled in the street. Combs stood outside his office at first light, letter and statements packed carefully into his saddlebags, torn between the ride to Austin, that couldn't wait, and the fight in his own town, that he couldn't bring himself to miss. Go, Cole told him, finding him there, as the sun climbed. Whatever happens here today, that letter needs to reach Austin. That matters more than watching. Feels like running. Feels like doing the one thing that actually finishes this, Cole said. Guns in the street settle one man at a time. Your letter settles the whole rotten machine behind him. Combs studied him a long moment. Then nodded slow and swung up into his saddle. Watch yourself, Cole. Always do. Combs rode north, out of Ashwater, the weight of 2 years finally, fully lifted from his shoulders, and behind him the town settled, into the particular held stillness that comes before violence everyone already knows is coming. Kessler was waiting in the street by mid-morning, standing loose and easy in the growing heat, hat brim low against the climbing sun. Cole walked out to meet him, from the direction of the forge, Nora watching from the boardwalk nearby, her wounded arms still bound, but her spine straight, refusing, the way she'd refused everything these past days, to look away from whatever came next. The two men stopped 40 feet apart. The same distance, though either had planned it, that Drey had always favored. Didn't figure you'd actually show, Kessler said. Figured you knew me better than that. Once did. Something almost like regret flickered across Kessler's face. Guess 2 years changes a man's read on people same, as it changes everything else. You could still walk, Cole said. Ride out. Leave this basin, and never come back, and I'll let it be. The same offer Drey had made him. The offer Cole hadn't taken. Kessler considered it a long moment, something working behind his careful eyes. Can't, he said finally. Not because Wexler's paying me. Money's not it anymore, if it ever really was. His jaw tightened. Because some debts don't get paid by running further away from them. Only way through this is through it. Then let's finish it, Cole said. Neither man moved for a long, suspended moment, the whole street holding its breath the way Ashwater had learned, for years running, to hold its breath before violence. Then Kessler's hand moved. And Cole's moved faster. It was over in less time than either man's memory could later properly account for. A single fluid motion, no hesitation, no offered mercy this time on either side, because both men understood, in the particular clarity that comes before a gunfight 2 years in the making, that mercy had already had its chance, and the moment for it had long since passed. Cole's shot took Kessler's center chest. Kessler's shot went wide, a half-second late, the particular fatal lag of a man whose heart, even at the very end, hadn't been fully in the killing. He went down slow. Not like Drey had gone down, all at once, surprised by his own mortality. Kessler went down like a man who'd been expecting this moment for 2 long years, and had simply been waiting, all this time, for it to finally arrive, and settle the account he never found the courage to settle any other way. Cole crossed the street. Knelt beside him. Kessler's eyes found his, already going glassy, already going distant. Judah. I'm here. Tell him. Kessler's breath caught, rattled. Tell Caleb I'm sorry. Tell him I was sorry the whole 2 years, even when I was pretending I wasn't. I'll tell him, Cole said, though there was no one left to hear it, no grave close enough to visit, only the promise itself, offered the way men offer the only comfort they have left to give. Kessler's eyes closed. The street stayed silent along, while after, the whole of Ashwater standing witness to the end of something that had started 2 years back, and 1,000 miles away, in a decision made by a frightened young man who told himself information wasn't the same as murder. Cornelius Wexler heard the shots, from his office window, and understood, with the particular cold clarity that had carried him, through decades of careful business, exactly what they meant. He didn't wait to confirm it. He was already at the strongbox, ledgers packed, correspondence burned in the small stove in the corner of his office, by the time footsteps sounded heavy on the boardwalk outside. The door opened without a knock. Nora Voss stood in the frame, filling it the way she'd filled the saloon doorway days before, her wounded arm bound, but her good hand steady on the hammer she still carried. The same one that had stopped Drey, and saved Cole's life both. Going somewhere, Mr. Wexler? Wexler's hand moved toward the drawer, where a small pistol had sat, untouched for years. An instrument he'd never once needed to use himself, because that was what men like Drey and Kessler had always been for. I wouldn't, Nora said. He looked at her. At the hammer. At the particular unshakable stillness in her stance, that told him, with total certainty, exactly what would happen if he finished reaching. His hand stopped. Clever woman, he said, something almost admiring in the bitterness of his voice. For years, and it took a blacksmith to finally corner me. For years too long, Nora said. But we're here now. Cole appeared in the doorway behind her a moment later, gun still in hand, having finished his own business in the street, and come looking, immediately, for whatever remained of Wexler's. Mr. Wexler, Cole said. Marshal Combs is already riding for Austin, with enough evidence to end this trust for good. Question now is just whether you're standing trial for it, or whether you're planning something considerably more permanent. Wexler looked between them, the tall woman, with the hammer, the quiet man, with the gun, and understood, finally, completely, that the empire he'd built, over 4 careful years, had come apart in less than a week, undone not by a faster gun, or a cleverer scheme, but by the simple, stubborn refusal of ordinary people to stay frightened forever. He raised his hands slow. I imagine, he said, voice gone flat, with defeat, there's no version of this, where I simply walk out that door. None, Cole said. But there's a version, where you walk to that jail cell instead of getting carried there. Wexler considered this. Nodded once, and let Cole take him by the arm, and lead him out, into the street, past the body still lying, where Kessler had fallen, past a town full of faces that no longer looked away. The weeks that followed brought change to Ashwater the way any long drought finally breaks. Slow at first, uncertain, then all at once, soaking deep into everything it touched. Combs returned from Austin 10 days later, with a federal marshal riding beside him, and a warrant that put an end, once and for all, to the Sable Ridge Land Trust's operations in the basin. Judge Averill was removed from the bench within the month. The families who'd been pressured to sell found, for the first time in 4 years, lawyers willing to fight for their claims instead of against them. Wexler stood trial in San Angelo that autumn. The verdict, when it came, was not merciful, but it was just, which was, everyone in Ashwater agreed, considerably more than the man had ever offered anyone else. Nora's arm healed slow, but clean, the doctor's promise holding true, and the scar she carried afterward became, in time, less a wound, and more a kind of quiet monument to the day everything in Ashwater finally changed. Cole stayed. Not out of obligation. Not because there was one more thread of the debt still unaccounted for. Because somewhere in those first weeks, after Kessler fell, and Wexler was led away in chains, Judah Cole had woken up one morning, and realized the weight in his chest, 2 years of grief, of guilt, of riding alone toward a reckoning he never quite believed would satisfy anything, had begun, slowly, unmistakably, to lift. And underneath it, something new had already started building in its place. He found himself, most evenings, at the forge, watching Nora work iron, with the same steady, patient strength that had first caught his attention in a saloon doorway. Some evenings he took up a hammer himself, clumsy at first, then less so, learning the trade the way a man learns anything worth keeping. Slow. With his hands. With somebody patient enough to teach him. You've got that look again, Nora said one evening, setting down her hammer, as the light went gold and long across the yard. What look? Like a man deciding something. Cole was quiet a long moment. 2 years, he said, I told myself there was only one thing left for me to do. Find the men responsible. Settle the account. And then. He shook his head slowly. Didn't ever let myself think past the then. And now. Now the account's settled. He looked at her, something steady and unguarded in his gray eyes that hadn't been there the day he rode into town. And I find myself thinking about the then a lot more than I expected to. Nora crossed the yard slow, careful of her healing arm, and stopped close in front of him. Ashwater could use a good man, she said. This forge could use one too, if he's willing to learn it properly instead of just standing around admiring the fire. Might take some convincing. I've got time, Nora said, and you've already seen what I do, with a hammer, when I set my mind to something. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Cole's face, the first real one anyone in Ashwater had seen there, since he'd ridden in. Reckon I have, he said. He stayed through the autumn, and through the winter, after that, and when spring finally came to the basin, green pushing up, through ground that 4 years of fear had left hard and silent, Judah Cole was still there. Working iron beside a woman, who had once stood in a doorway, with nothing but a hammer, and enough courage for the both of them, and who had never once, in all the months since, asked him to be anything other than exactly what he was. The church bell, silent for the better part of a year, before that August, rang every Sunday now. Rang for weddings, twice that first spring, and christenings, and once, quietly, for old Amos Teague, who passed peaceful in his sleep, that winter having lived long enough to see the town he loved learn how to breathe again. Ashwater remembered Emmett Drey the way towns remember storms. Something that happened to them once, that reshaped the ground beneath their feet, that they survived by holding together instead of pulling apart. They remembered Cornelius Wexler mostly, as a name on a court document, filed away in San Angelo, tidy and small, and stripped of every ounce of the fear he'd once commanded. And they remembered, most of all, the morning a tall woman, with a blacksmith's hammer walked into a saloon, and said 2 words, that cracked 4 years wide open. Not today! Because that, in the end, was what Ashwater had needed most. Not a faster gun. Not a stranger's aim, though that mattered plenty, and every soul in town knew it. What Ashwater had needed was a single voice willing to stand in a doorway, and refuse, out loud, in front of everyone, to be afraid any longer. Once that voice spoke, the rest of them found they still remembered how to speak too. Judah Cole rode out from Ashwater exactly once more that year, in the early summer, to settle the last of his affairs in Austin, and close, formally, the chapter of his life that had started, with a telegram at Fort Concho, and a promise made to a dead man he had failed to protect. He filed a report of his own, this one, unlike Caleb's, actually reaching the hands that needed it, and when he finished, he stood a long moment in the ranger office, where he'd once worn a badge, looking at the space on the wall, where commendations hung, and felt something settle in his chest, that 2 years of hard riding had never once managed to give him. Peace. Not the absence of grief. Grief doesn't leave a man, not really, not for someone he loved. But peace enough to carry it, without it dragging him under. Peace enough, finally, to ride home instead of away. Because that was what Ashwater had become to him, somewhere in the months since that August afternoon. Not a stop along a hunt that never ended. A home. The kind a man doesn't find by searching for it directly, but stumbles into sideways, in the middle of somebody else's fight, standing in a forge yard, with the smoke thinning gold against an evening sky. He rode back into town on a warm June evening, and Nora was waiting at the edge of the road the way she always did now, not because she doubted he'd return, but because watching for him had become one of the small good habits a person builds, when the fear finally leaves enough room for something gentler to grow in its place. Well, she said, as he swung down from the saddle. Ranger business all settled. All settled, Cole said. Good. She looked at him a long moment, something warm and certain in her face, that hadn't been there the day he'd ridden in a year before, carrying nothing but a debt, and a worn colt, and eyes the color of iron left too long in the rain. Because the forge has a lot of work waiting, and I'm getting tired of doing it short-handed. Cole looked past her, down the street, at Ashwater in the last gold light of evening. At the mercantile with its shelves full again. At the marshal's office, door open wide, Ezra Combs standing in the frame, with his hat off, waving. At the church, its bell hanging quiet now, but ready, the way bells are always ready, for whatever came next worth ringing for. Then he looked back at Nora. Lead the way, he said. And together they walked back, into town, into the long gold evening, into whatever came after 4 years of silence finally broken, and the bell in the steeple, waiting patient in the dusk, did not ring that night. It didn't need to. Ashwater was already speaking for itself.